Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about reserves, whether to save or not to save. There's so much going on at the moment with our legislators, both on the House as well as the Senate. Today, I have the pleasure of being here with Will from Association Reserves. We're going to kind of go over a little bit of reserves, reserve studies, talk a little bit about what's going on with the different bills. However, we do want you to keep in mind that nothing is set in stone yet. We won't know until a couple months from now. So we're just kind of being proactive here, letting our board members, managers, and anyone that's in the association world know of what's going on and what the potential impacts are going to be to our industry, so that you could take whatever steps you feel it's necessary for your community to address the potential changes that are coming. There are many changes that are expected, especially with what occurred at the tragedy at Champlain Towers. This is top of mind for many of our legislators. So as we let the board members and managers log in, we do have a Q&A available either at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. Please feel free to ask any questions. Will and I will do our best to answer them either live or in the chat. So please don't hesitate to ask us any questions that have to do with reserves. So with further ado, I wanted to, Will, if you could say a little bit about yourself and the firm you represent and how, I know you cover more counties than just Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach.
Yes, yeah, we do. Yeah, good morning, Raphael, and thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for my company, which is called Association Reserves. We are, if not the oldest one, certainly one of the oldest and largest reserve study providers in the country. We've been in business since 1986. We have at this point 12 regional offices throughout the country. We have clients in all 50 states, as well as a bunch of different exotic locales around the world. We are strictly a reserve study provider. So, at this point, I think as a company, we've done over 70,000 reserve studies. In other words, we are not an engineering firm or an accounting firm that does reserve studies as kind of a side business. This is strictly all we do every day is work with community associations, all types of condos, HOAs, but also timeshare resorts, other types of facilities. And we help them with their long-term budgeting and forecasting and help them to reduce the risk of financial distress by, budgeting for reserves and helping to plan ahead for these projects. So, as you said, Raphael, a lot of interesting things going on in our world right now. Ever since June 24th of last summer, when Champlain Tower South collapsed, it's really been a wake-up call for the entire industry. So it's an interesting time to be in the community association business, particularly in Florida. Let's see, I guess about me, I've been with the company about 14 years. I'm a credentialed reserve specialist. I've completed and overseen thousands of reserve studies myself. So hopefully between the two of us, we can answer a lot of good questions today.
All right, we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Will. It's always a pleasure to have you on our webinars. You always bring a ton of wealth of knowledge, and I know you're very well connected with what's going on both from the House and Senate side. So I know you have a lot of knowledge that you can provide to our listeners here today. As for myself, my name is Raphael Aquino. I am the CEO and co-founder of Affinity Management Services. We are a community association management company. We manage properties throughout Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. We're more of a boutique operation, so we look for those associations that are really looking for that personal touch. So enough about me and us. I think our listeners are really here to learn a little bit more about reserves. As I mentioned earlier, for those of you that just logged in, we do have the Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions that you may have. We'll do our best to get to those questions either live or we'll type them in. So Will, I want to start off with kind of the first question. There's so much going on. I know when you read the House bill, there's certain recommendations there. When you read the Senate bill, there's certain recommendations there. I think it'd be great to really focus on what are the potential impacts that our associations are going to have when it comes to reserve studies. I find it to be amazing that we're putting this kind of language into these bills, because I think many associations have never really understood the value, at least those that don't have it, have never really understood the value of a reserve study. I know from a management side, it's something that we've always been an advocate of. We try to promote it as much as possible. So if you could kind of give a high level of what a reserve study is and what our legislators are putting into potentially putting into play.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a very dense question. I'm going to try to tackle it from a couple of different angles, but let's start with kind of the basics. I mean, a reserve study is basically a budget planning tool. It's a report that a property uses to help identify what its long-term maintenance, repair, and replacement obligations will be over time, and then a corresponding financial analysis that helps them to determine how much money they need to be setting aside to pay for those things. So, it's typically done in two parts. There's what's called a physical analysis and then a financial analysis. So in the physical analysis, that's more the building science side of what we do. Somebody like me or somebody like our company goes out and does an inspection of a property to identify, first of all, what is there, what that property should be reserving for. What are these routine, predictable projects that they will definitely face in their future? What are the conditions of those things? What is their life expectancy? What's the scope of work going to look like when that project needs to get done? And therefore, how much money does that community need to be saving so that they are prepared to tackle that and they don't get caught by surprise and they don't need to rely on special assessments or bank loans to pay for these things. If you have a good reserve study, it should give you a nice kind of financial roadmap that shows all of the owners, all the stakeholders in the property, what the true cost of ownership is going to be. And that's a phrase I might use a couple times today, and that you're going to hear a lot in the next several months, the true cost of ownership living in a condo or an HOA. So that's basically what we do. It's, we are an independent third party that has the right skill set to understand what buildings need to be planning for. And hopefully the result is the owners enjoy a better ownership experience because they're not picking up the tab for prior generations of owners that never funded their reserves. And now all these projects are coming due and there's no other recourse. What we try to do is just spread things over the entire life of the property so that everybody who comes and goes as an owner in that property is paying their fair share of the cost of all those components, whether or not they're actually there at the time the work gets done. I think that's an important factor to consider. This is, reserve funding and paying for these projects is not supposed to be a game of musical chairs, right? Where there's just some unlucky group of people who happen to live in the building when the elevators need to be modernized and the concrete restoration comes due. That's not the way it's supposed to happen.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. I mean, and what's sad is it's great how you mentioned it. You say, the true cost is, because I say in a similar fashion. Many associations, when they don't have any reserves, the transparency in some cases does not exist. Owners are buying into something and, either someone didn't tell them this is what you should be looking for when you're buying into a condo, right. They're inexperienced, and who gets impacted the most are the individuals that are on fixed incomes, because they find themselves in a situation where obviously their income is fixed. No one put away reserves for a roof, and all of a sudden 13 buildings need to have their roofs redone. Right. And there's a special assessment for $20,000 or a loan that needs to be done. And it puts the board in a very difficult decision, a very difficult position, of what to do. And in some cases, not all, some boards don't make the right decision. They kind of kick the can down the road and let the next person deal with this. We'll do some patchwork in the interim. I won't be here next year. I'll let the next person deal with it. So I think if, there is talks of potentially having certain reserve requirements, we'll see what ends up transpiring. But I know it'll make our lives much easier if every association had the proper reserves. We can make decisions based on business rather than emotion and the challenges that the community is having. I know we've had the question asked to us many times, and I'm sure you as well. From what your understanding is, that you believe the legislation that this requirement of reserve studies only going to be for condos and co-ops, or is your understanding that it's going to be for HOAs as well?
As far as we know right now, the conversation is just about condos, and to be even more specific, it's condos 3 stories and up. Now that is a detail that object against. I mean, there's plenty of 1-story and 2-story developments out there that have major problems. You know, they still have roofs, they still have painting work to do, they still have parking lots and swimming pools and tennis courts. I don't think it's a good idea to overlook buildings below 3 stories, but it is what it is. That's the way the bills are being addressed right now. HOAs and well, I guess what's true for condos generally is true for co-ops. I don't know that, you know, I'd have to look at the current text of the bill to see if they specifically address co-ops or not. Typically they're under a different statute, but usually things start with the condo world and then they kind of trickle down, and at least in terms of best practices. So yeah, I think just to, you know, take a bird's eye view for a moment, there's a couple of things I wanted to point out. First of all, this is very much a developing story, right? These bills are still being worked on. They're still going through the various, you know, stages of the legislative process. We're going to know pretty soon what the final bill is going to look like, and that's what's going to go to the governor. That will happen this spring. I guess, you know, being a national reserve study provider, we do have some additional perspective to share about what's done in other states, right? So there are a number of states, I believe 8 or 9 states in the US right now, where reserve studies are required by law. And typically the best practice there, what's been done in other states, is about every 3 years, meaning every 3rd year, the association has what's called an update with a site visit. So it means that somebody is coming back physically to the property to re-inspect it, reevaluate it, and then produce a new financial analysis that community can use, you know, going forward. That's not to say that reserves shouldn't be part of your annual budget process, right? Every year, each association has to produce a budget. And so at the very least, they need to be looking over that reserve schedule, making adjustments to life expectancies and costs, and kind of course correcting and recalibrating each year with each budget cycle. But that's, you know, in terms of the 2 bills that we have going through the government and here in Florida, right now, the Senate bill is proposing an every 3-year requirement, which we definitely are in favor of. The House bill, in my opinion, is far inferior to the Senate bill for a number of reasons, but one of which is that they're suggesting that reserve study only needs to be done every 10 years. That is way too long to wait. You know, we both know, and I'm sure many people joining us today know, in Florida, with the harsh building environment we live in, things can happen very quickly. You know, something that's in great condition one year can very quickly fall apart just because of the amount of sun and rain and wind and salt water and just the harshness of, you know, the climate down here. That can change the life expectancy for components very quickly if they're not properly maintained. So waiting 10 years between updates is, you know, it's better than nothing, but that's not sufficient. So whatever the bill, you know, whatever the outcome of this process, I would definitely encourage everybody out there to think of updating their reserves. And again, whether you're hiring a professional or not, this is a constant, ongoing, you know, what we call a living document. It's something that should be refreshed on a very frequent basis.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the Senate bill has it, as we were talking about a little bit before we got on the webinar, it has it right. You know, every 3 years, there's so much to take into consideration. You know, as you stated, depending where the property is located, you know, it can have more wear and tear. And it's good to at least know, you know, many times as a community association manager, you know, you're bogged down with the day to day, and we highly count on our partners to really let us know what's going on. So having an update every 3 years lets you know where you stand. Barry brings up a point here, and I'm curious to see how you're managing this. When it comes to, let's say, the reserve study itself, and, you know, with inflation, the way that things have happened, you know, this past, you know, year, I would say, I think last time was 7.2 that we were experiencing. How does that get factored in to reserve study? Is that something that should be considered, especially doing it every 36 months because of the potential increases in inflation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the last year, 18 months has certainly been pretty much a roller coaster ride when it comes to pricing of things.
Yeah.
We all know that on a personal level, just going to the gas pump or going to the grocery store, we certainly feel that. If you're in the business of estimating costs for big projects, you certainly feel that too, right? So I guess, you know, we kind of have 2 thoughts on the matter. First of all, a reserve study always needs to incorporate the current cost of building projects, whatever those may be, especially if the building is, you know, needing to do this work very quickly, right? I feel bad for the properties out there right now that have major projects to do in the very near future, say in the next 1 to 3 years, because they may get stuck paying this kind of inflated cost, and it's unlucky. It's just bad timing. But that's the reality of the situation. So their reserve study, their reserve plan should reflect that. Now, if it's a brand new property, right, let's say something that was just turned over in the last year or two, and most of those projects are 5, 10, even 15, 20 years down the road, in those cases, we might be looking at a little bit, or trying to prognosticate, I guess, a little bit more realistically, saying right now the current market prices are, very, very high. So do we want to use those things and set the course for this association for the long term based on this, what may be a temporarily inflated situation, or do we want to use what's kind of a normal, quote unquote, normal market price, something we saw a year or two ago? There's no easy answer to that. I guess everybody just needs to be cognizant of the fact that these numbers will change. Some things may come back down to kind of their pre-COVID levels. Other components may get stuck at this new price point, and that just may be the new reality. So I would say, work with your team, work with your reserve study provider, talk to your vendors, find out from your elevator company or your air conditioning company, hey, what are the current market prices for a cooling tower, for an elevator modernization, and just get their opinion. Hey, do you see prices coming back down soon or not, and act accordingly. So for those boards out there that are kind of doing this planning, doing their own sort of reserve schedules, I mean, those are the right questions to be asking.
Excellent point. And part of the reserve study, we're seeing at least in the Senate bill, that now they're identifying the specifics of what needs to be included within these reserve studies. I know in the past, really the requirement was the major 4 or 5 components that we needed to at least place when kind of quote unquote fully funded reserves, which both you and I know that's not necessarily fully funded. Mm-hmm. What's your input on the items that are being included? Do you think it's a good enough list, or you think it's a great start? And within the services that you provide, are all those components already included within the reserve studies you do today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So just for everyone's benefit, if you're not familiar with the current statutes, all condominium associations in Florida right now are required to budget reserves for roofing, painting, pavement resurfacing, and anything over $10,000. So that's kind of the existing checklist, if you will. What the legislation is attempting to do is expand upon that list, add some things to it that should be inspected and considered as part of a reserve plan. To me, when I look at that list, almost everything that they're proposing are already things that we would routinely put into a reserve study. For a typical high-rise building, we're often anywhere from 50 to 80 individual components. So our studies and other professionals, they're already pretty comprehensive. There are certain things in the bills that really don't fit the criteria of a reserve study, though. I mean, they're suggesting the foundation of a building, load-bearing structural walls. These are things you really should never have to replace. So you wouldn't actively reserve for them. Now, yes, you do want to have allowances for concrete restoration for balconies and planters and pool decks and all that kind of stuff, but there's never a time when you budget to replace the foundation of a building, right? So there's just certain things in there that I think are an overreach. Others that are kind of a gray area. There's I think one other criteria said irrigation systems. Yeah. Well, for the most part, unless you have a big packaged pump system, those can be quite expensive. But for the most part, you're talking about PVC pipe in the ground, which A, should have a very long, maybe indefinite useful life, and B, the cost to replace it or repair it over time are fairly minimal. That's almost always something you do on the operating side. So, big picture, we don't really favor a sort of checklist approach where we walk out to a property and, okay, here's my dozen things that the state says have to be in this reserve study, because not all condos are the same, right? You've got old buildings, new buildings, coastal properties, inland properties, high rises, low rises. everything in between. The way that we as professionals look at any property is actually by going what are called National Reserve Study standards. And we have a 4-part criteria that we use to define what should go in the reserve plan for that building. So the 4 parts of that test are, is the association responsible for this thing? Right, that's pretty easy, sort of black and white definition. Number 2, does this have a limited useful life? All right, so limited meaning it's going to fail at some point. That's a routine expected project, right? So again, something that might fail that part of the test typically would be the foundation of the building. That should not be a life limited component. The 3rd part, does this component have a predictable remaining useful life? And so the key word there is predictable. What are you going to do to this thing, and how often are you going to do it? Now, if you can put a good put some data around that, roughly what the scope of work is going to be, and you can plan ahead for it, then yes, that's a nice cyclical project you put in your reserve plan. And in other words, things like insurance deductibles, paying your insurance deductible in the event of a major storm, we don't know when those are going to happen, right? So if I just make a wild guess and say, yeah, every 6 years we're going to get a hurricane, so plan on this expense every 6 years, I'm going to be basing a bunch of funding calculations off that assumption, which are, kind of arbitrary.
Correct.
And then the last part, does this component meet a significant threshold cost to this community? Now, again, we have the $10,000 number in statutes currently, but that $10,000 number applies to a little 4-unit single-story building the same way it does to a 500-unit 50-story luxury tower. So what's significant to one may not be significant to the other. And so that can be a sliding scale that we use depending on the property, right? So that's, rather than going in with a predefined checklist of things to include, we go in with this open-ended 4-part criteria, and whatever exists at that property that meets those 4 criteria, that's something that should be in that particular reserve study, that plan.
Excellent. I think I also want to highlight again that point that you mentioned of right now the bill, the way it states is that any building above 3 stories is what would be required to have a reserve study. And I'd have to agree with you, Will, that I think that's a bit short-sighted as well. We have associations that are 600 units, I think it's 17 buildings, and they're only 2 stories, but that's not to say that they don't have lifts, that elevators. They actually have major roofs. So I think it is a bit short-sighted. Obviously, our legislators don't understand. I know from a management side, we're lobbying at least to let them know that this should be changed. I'm sure you guys are doing the same. But either way, remember, whatever passes, it doesn't mean that if you are a 3-story building that you shouldn't take the necessary steps. The same thing goes with HOAs. We highly recommend it. We're telling our HOAs today, listen, this is what's going on. It's happening on the condo side, but we highly urge you do the same for the HOA, just because, you have roadways, you have, as you stated, some of these large HOAs have big irrigation pumps. And if you're not putting away for these pumps, you'll find yourself with a surprise. You have clubhouses. There's so much that goes into it. Right. Maybe not the same amount of components, but I know you guys have done some reserve studies for some of these HOAs, and it's pretty eye-opening how much you should have. So we are urging, at least as an organization, for our HOAs to just follow the same lead that we're seeing on the condo side. You mentioned that there's certain guidelines that you follow, that you guide yourself by. So I kind of want to touch on this question because I know that there's different discussions on different bills of who should be doing the reserve study, what's the licensure that's required. So I guess if you could talk a little bit about what you believe is where you believe this is leading, and what's the difference between having a reserve study and someone that doesn't have a reserve license, reserve specialist license, and someone that doesn't.
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting question. I mean, the work that we do is pretty complicated in the sense that it's a learn by doing job. I mean, there is no particular college degree or prior work experience that can perfectly set you up for how to do reserve studies. We do have people on staff that come from technical backgrounds. They have engineering degrees. We've had success with people that have architecture backgrounds, construction management, but even former property managers, business majors, accounting majors. I mean, the work that we do is a blend of different things. It's a blend of building sciences and accounting and finance, right? You need to know a lot about what causes components to age and fail and need to be replaced and how to price those projects out, but then also have the kind of financial skill set to model those costs into the future, to understand the impacts of interest and inflation, and deliver an actual workable recommendation for a client. There are two existing professional credentials nationally recognized for people who are professional reserve study preparers. One is the RS, it's a reserve specialist. The other is a PRA, professional reserve analyst. And the qualifications are about the same to have either one. Those are the people that are, have demonstrated the experience and expertise required in preparing reserve studies. Now, are some of them also engineers or architects? Yes, of course. We've had some on staff. We have, other companies in our industry that have, people with these licensed backgrounds. I'll be the first to tell you though, and I think almost anybody in our field would agree, having that particular skill set does not qualify you to do reserve studies. You might be the best structural engineer in Florida, okay? And you may be an absolute whiz when it comes to evaluating, concrete columns and balconies and planners and building envelope type components. That does not in any way give you the skill set to look at an elevator modernization life cycle or a parking lot project or a swimming pool or a tennis court, cooling towers. Again, what we do is very broad and kind of all encompassing. Sometimes we describe our scope of work as like an inch deep, but a mile wide. Now, where the two professions kind of intersect is when there's a specific problem at a building that requires a more in-depth evaluation. That is absolutely the time when you need to bring in that expert, that fire safety engineer, that seawall, coastal marine, coastal structures expert, your elevator consultant, your roof consultant. There is a time and a place where you need to engage those professionals. And absolutely, when it comes to the structural evaluations that are also part of this bill, these what they're calling the milestone reports or recertification reports, those should be done by somebody with expertise in looking at building structures and evaluating the severity of cracks and delaminated stucco and concrete spalling and all the other issues that are very common in South Florida. But they're not one and the same, right? So I use this medical analogy a lot where, a reserve specialist, somebody who's doing a reserve study, we're looking at the overall financial health of the property in the same way that, maybe a general practitioner, family doctor down the street might look at your overall physical health, right? But if in the course of having that annual checkup done, your general practitioner discovers, hey, you know what? I hear something in your heartbeat that I don't like, or you're getting these crazy headaches, you might need to go see a neurosurgeon, right? There's a time and a place where they're going to refer you to a specialist, right? And you're going to go see that specialist. They're going to get laser focused on this one particular issue. And then once you have that extra knowledge, now you can go back to your main doctor and incorporate that into your overall health, right? So I think a reserve specialist, a reserve study kind of functions in the same way. Our job is to look at the big picture and then drill down or recommend that you drill down on specific issues. But kind of like with the human body, if you are taking care of your overall health, right? If you're being proactive, if you're doing the preventive maintenance work required to maintain your body, then the chances of those other problems happening will be less, right? So if you start off as a building with a very good reserve plan and you're budgeting accordingly, you're painting and waterproofing the property on a good cycle, hopefully that minimizes the risk of any of those major structural problems that might come later on. So there's kind of a give and take between a reserve study and some other type of expertise, but they're not one and the same. So, the Senate bill has recognized that. The Senate bill is saying that, the reserve studies should be done by people who know what they're doing, which can be a qualified reserve professional. It can be an architect or an engineer, I guess, if they have the right training and experience for it. But they should not be conflating the two, right?
Correct. Yeah. And I know I've taken the position in our group that yeah, it should be okay that someone that has their reserve specialist license should be able to conduct it. You guys, at least for your firm, I know you've done thousands of reserve studies, so it makes no sense. Also, as we were talking a little bit offline, if they only required engineers to do it, I can't imagine what would happen with everything else that they're going to have to do
Right.
with the potential changes. So
Yeah.
I would have to agree with you. You guys have the software, you have the knowledge, you already have the contacts, and you have the certification that you guide yourselves by. No different than let's say our CAM licenses. You know,
Yeah.
you go through your process. That's like if all of a sudden they required, someone that has their CAM license to either have a master's degree from a college. That would just be a complete game changer for the industry as a whole.
Yeah.
So
No, I think you would agree that, really when it comes to properly running an association, you need a team of experts, right?
100%.
You need a great attorney, you need a great CPA, you need a great manager, you need a good reserve study, you need a bunch of other qualified vendors, you need a great pool guy, right? You need a good elevator company. And when it comes time to do anything, construction related, or there's a serious problem, then you need an architect or an engineer or some expert in that field. But everybody needs to understand kind of their role on the team and how they all fit together. So the board members out there, they're kind of like the manager of that team. They need to bring in the right people at the right time and get the right skill set involved when they need it to help manage that community.
Correct, 100%. Without our professionals, we really wouldn't be able to do the job that we do. We count heavily, even though sometimes board members believe we should be able to do everything. But the reality is that we rely heavily, as you stated, on our partners. I do know within, I believe it's in the House bill, that there's some discussion of how the reserves need to be set aside. I believe at one point, I'm not sure if this has changed, that certain parts of it needed to be straight line, and then the rest could be pooled. What's your opinion, I guess, and what's your experience in general? Because we don't know what's going to finally come out of this. But what have you seen as the best practices when it comes to setting aside your reserves, either pooled method or straight line method, or what do you see the pros and cons in each?
Pooled method is absolutely the way to go. There's just no question about it. The straight line method is a very outdated, old school, overly conservative way of calculating reserve contributions. Part of the reason why let me back up. Nobody outside of Florida uses the straight line method. Okay. It's only in Florida. We work in all 50 states. Everywhere we work, the pooled method it's just understood. That's the superior way to go. It allows for a more efficient distribution of reserve cash. It requires less amount of money from the owners to fund that method than it does straight line. Just real quickly, we did an internal analysis a year or two ago on our clients that were still using straight line. And when we showed them what would happen if they were to pool their reserves, on average, that meant they could contribute about a third the amount that they would require if they stayed with straight line. So, so for those of you out there who are trying to save money, you got people on a fixed income, that's a great way to do it. Pool your reserves together. So anyways, pooled reserves by far the superior method. What you're, what you're seeing in the House bill in particular is this kind of language or this orientation around restricting funds that are meant to be used for structural and life safety issues, right? Yeah. Now, the problem is that bill is painting in two very broad categories. It's basically saying, hey, there are things that are structural, life safety issues. People are going to die if these things don't get done right. And then everything else is fluff, is cosmetic, it's subjective, it's not really that important, right? But where would you put something like a cooling tower, right? Or an elevator? These are not necessarily life safety issues, but they're certainly not just fluff, right? Good luck living in a building without a cooling tower for a week in Florida. Correct. So that's the problem. And the way that the bill is written, in putting things into these broad categories, they're saying, okay, if you have these structural components, then the funds for those components can only be used for those things, and everything else is you can commingle your funds for all the fluffy stuff if you want, but these categories, and there's I want to say 12 or 14 things on that list, these need to be restricted, essentially promoting a straight line approach to funding. which is going to cost a lot more money for those owners. It's going to make a lot more headaches for those boards and management companies to try to manage funds that are locked up in these various categories only for those things. Not to mention, what are we supposed to tell the thousands and thousands of associations that do currently pool their reserves? Now they're going to need to break those apart into these various sections. It's an unworkable suggestion, and certainly something we would want to get rid of. So, the latest version of the Senate bill, I think, has effectively addressed that. It's talking about the ability to pool the reserves.
Correct.
And that's just the way it should be. The straight line method, because I know the question will come up, and I'm sure there's people out there with their hands crossed saying, well, I like the straight line method. So I'll give a moment's thought to the argument there.
Yeah, no, I have to agree with you, Will, there that the pool method is the way to go.
Right.
You don't know. Listen, you guys are giving estimates, right? And these reserve studies, they're estimates. Even if you're doing the best that you can, let's say in the cooling tower that we keep bringing that up,
right?
And you're maintaining it properly, you're doing your preventative maintenance. Equipment is equipment. Sometimes something can just go wrong. And if you haven't fully funded that, the last thing you want to be able to do is say, okay, well, I have $4 million in the reserves. I only have 200,000 for the cooling tower, but the cooling tower is going to cost me 500,000. Have to go running around to locate those 200,000. So I do find the pooling method to be much easier. I understand a bit why they want the straight line, I guess, for a little bit more transparency, a little bit more control. But ultimately, I think that what it's going to provide more flexibility, which is what boards need so that they can make the proper decision, is the pooled method. Well, and that's interesting that you said that we're the only state that has that. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the only reason why people like the straight line method is this perception that it allows for more control.
Correct.
And it's going to protect the association from a rogue group of board members who are going to want to come in and drain the reserves all for some silly project, right?
Yeah.
What people are afraid of there, I don't think that's a very well-grounded fear, to be honest, because anytime a board is making bad decisions financially, if they are in breach of their fiduciary duty, if they're not observing the business judgment rule, if they're draining, all this money that was meant to be used for the roof and the elevators and the fire alarm and everything else, and they want to go out and develop this multi-million-dollar lobby project, all of the owners in that association could basically sue them for breach of fiduciary duty, saying this was a mismanagement of our funds. No prudent person would have done this, understanding all the other challenges we're facing. And if that's the case, if those board members choose to do that, they are not going to be covered by their D&O coverage, right? Your directors and officers coverage as a board member only protects you if you're observing the business judgment rule. So if you're being reckless, if you're spending money the way you shouldn't, you're going to find yourself in hot water. So for the people out there that are holding that up as the argument in favor of straight line, I think that's the counter to it is, if that really happens, if you get a group that's going to come in and mismanage the reserve fund, take them to task for that. They should not get away with that. But I've been doing this a long time, and I really, anecdotally, maybe I've heard it a few times, but that is not a chronic and consistent problem. If it was, we would be seeing that across the country, and it's just not true.
Correct. And yeah, that's a great point. I mean, ultimately, if that is your concern, then you should just be watching the financials and run for the board, because it's not a dictatorship at the end of the day. If you're asking for your financials, in most cases, if your association's over 150 units, your financials will be online and you're reviewing it, then you'll know immediately what's going on and you can probe a little bit more. I do have two questions, a little bit different, but they have to go with the topic that we're talking about. And L. Weathers asked, basically, if you can elaborate a little bit more on the pooled method and why it's less expensive. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So let me take 2 minutes and just kind of explain the nuts and bolts of each method. So I'll start with the straight line method. Okay. In straight line reserve funding, you have all these various categories. Imagine a bunch of different buckets of money in front of you at budget time, and you're going to contribute to each bucket of money individually and separate from the rest. So you may have roof reserves, elevator reserves, painting reserves, swimming pool, and mechanical, let's say. And when you're doing your calculations to fund each bucket, you're looking at the contents of how much money you have, how much is in each bucket of money now, and doing a calculation that looks only at the component to be funded by that category, that bucket of reserves, ignoring the fact that there's other money sitting elsewhere, right? Now, if you have a overage or a deficit in one of those accounts, you still have to fund it according to the calculation. So even if your cooling tower reserve fund is well below where it should be, you would have to fund an extra amount to bring that up to where it should be relative to the age of the cooling tower, when in reality, there might be plenty of money sitting in some other low priority place, something that was meant for a swimming pool or a tennis court, that in theory, you should be able to transfer from one place to the other to kind of balance things out. The problem is, and Raphael, I'm sure you appreciate this, the mechanics of how to do that are very difficult. You have to get the owners, a majority of the owners in the community, to approve the use of one reserve account to pay for another project. It's called a non-scheduled use of reserve funds. And getting a quorum, getting all the votes required to do that's very difficult, and in fact, often doesn't work. So what you're left with is this underfunded account that the owners have to overly fund, even though there's plenty of money sitting somewhere else that they could likely use. Imagine if you just as an individual, you had like 12 different checking accounts, and you could only use your Publix groceries checking account for buying food, and you had your Toyota car payment for paying your car, and your FP&L, and you're ignoring the fact that in total you've got a lot of money, but it's locked up in these various categories. And if you're a little bit short on groceries that month, you can't just move money from one other account into that. Okay. Now, pooling the reserves, imagine taking all those buckets, dumping them into one big bathtub, right? Now you have one pool of funds that is collectively available for any of your reserve components. Okay. It does not create a slush fund. By doing that, you haven't just open the doors to reckless spending. It's still only restricted to reserve components, but it's a more efficient distribution of all of your available cash. Now, what you care about when you're budgeting is that the total size of the pool grows and shrinks proportionally to the work you have to do. And as long as you never take your pool of funds too low, in reality, anything above zero is considered sufficient. That's what you're going to be funding towards. So it's a lesser overall amount of funding, lesser cash out of pocket from your owners to fund towards that pool of funds rather than these isolated, separated straight line accounts.
Yeah, that's exactly on point when it comes to, at least from a management side, of having to, take from here to move it there. When you have straight line, you have to take a membership vote. And again, that's why I was mentioning earlier, it becomes very difficult to have to do that. And then memberships kind of doesn't really understand. So having it in a pool is, in my opinion, the way to go for associations. I have another question here that they ask, can they take from the reserves fund to, let's say, do an elevator repair? So let's say one of the cart wheels went bad, but they're reserving for the elevator. Are they allowed to be able to tap into that reserve fund?
Yes. So technically speaking, as long as the owners approve it, you can actually use reserve money for anything you want. As long as you get your owners to approve the spending, you can use reserves for any non-scheduled use. I'm not saying you should do that, but technically speaking, you can do that. Now, even without a vote, yes, it is prudent and justifiable to use reserve money for major repairs to extend the life of something, right? So like elevators are a good example. You have some critical component of the elevator, maybe that's going to cost you $10,000, that needs to be replaced. Otherwise, it's going to trigger a full modernization, and it's going to be 20x the price. Spending that $10,000 to extend the overall life of the modernization, yeah, to me, that's a perfectly reasonable use of your elevator reserves or your pooled reserve account. You don't want to be reckless, and you don't want to be frivolous, right? Normal routine maintenance, that should always come out of the operating budget. But significant repairs, roof repairs after a major storm, partial concrete restoration in between major painting cycles. Yeah, those are all things you can definitely spend reserves
Correct.
for.
Yeah, and I bring up the elevator example because that's actually, we were just going through that with one of our associations, and we tapped into the reserves because we needed to change several wheels and parts within the cart in order to extend the life of the cart so that we don't have to do a full mod. And it's normal to be able to do that. Where
Mhm.
you find, where you're dipping into the putting your hand into the cookie jar is when you're doing, as you stated, like the preventative maintenance. All that should be coming from your operating budget. So that there needs to be a clear delineation between the two, between the board as well as management, or the property management company if you have a professional company managing your association. I have another question here that comes. Is there a good reason to change the reserve contributions from a monthly or quarterly basis to be placed in? Oh, basically, they're asking is, instead of having a reserve, of having a contingency fund, and then at the end of the year depositing that into reserves.
Okay, so reserves are contributing to reserves is a proactive process. It's not a process of crossing your fingers and hoping that there's some money left at the end of the year, which you can transfer into your reserve account. I believe, I'm pretty certain about this. If you have monthly collections, monthly dues from the owners, there needs to be a monthly reserve contribution. If it's quarterly, then it can be quarterly, but I believe it has to be within 30 days of the collection of the assessments that contribution is made. So if your association has a monthly dues cycle, you can't just operate throughout the year with a contingency approach, assuming you'll make one big transfer at the end of the year. That needs to be a constant, ongoing process. We want people to think of reserve funding as paying a current bill. Okay, think of your roof as aging and deteriorating every single year. Let's say it's got a 20-year useful life. That means roughly 5% of its value is lost each year. And you should be contributing to reserves at roughly 5% of that total replacement cost each year to offset that deterioration. So it's a constant, ongoing process by which you offset the level of deterioration that's occurring. The byproduct of doing that, of course, is that after 20 years, you've done that very regularly, you've accumulated all the money you need to go out and buy a new roof. That's, again, another way that you make sure everybody's paying their fair share. They're paying their portion of the cost of that bill of deterioration. It's not just a matter of saving up a bunch of money all at once to do a project or going out and borrowing money. You want to think of your reserve contributions as paying a current bill. That will help kind of turn the lights on for people in terms of their understanding, I think.
Okay, excellent. And I have another question. I guess the inflation thing is a big topic. We're all experiencing it on a day-to-day.
Right.
Sue asks, is there inflation built into replacement costs in a reserve study for future projects? And she also asks, is there any discount built into the expected interest income? If so, what is the rate?
Yeah, I'm going to answer those in the reverse order. Yeah, so interest income definitely is something that you can model into your cash flow projections, and you should. If you're earning interest on your reserve accounts, and that's never a very exciting return, maybe 1%, but that helps, right? So every dollar the bank is paying you in interest is a dollar you don't have to collect from your owners, if you think of it that way. So yes, you can and should model interest income into your analysis. Now, inflation is a trickier subject, and I don't want to take up too much time on this, but I'll try to give a concise answer. At present, when you're talking about pooled reserve funding, there is a sentence in the Florida Administrative Code that says this shall not include any balloon payments, meaning we can't increase the contribution rate to reserves going in from one year to the next. Now, that creates a problem if you're going to include inflation on your costs, because that means you would have inflation causing the cost of building components to rise over time, but we're not allowed to come up with a similar rise in contribution rates. So to offset that discrepancy, our company and most of the other companies that are doing this right now in Florida are not using inflation in their studies. Now, that's not because we don't think inflation is real. It's a silly restriction that's being placed upon us at the moment. Now, I'm sure the question will come up. And I want to say very publicly, we are trying to fight this. Part of this legislative process we're doing right now is working with the DBPR. I was in Tallahassee working with some Senate staff a matter of weeks ago, talking about this whole balloon payment issue and trying to get them to reinterpret that phrase or publish a declaratory statement so we can get rid of that, go back to modeling inflation in our studies, because that is real. It's just a silly kind of facet of what we do right now. I think I'm pretty confident that's going to go away. regardless, when you're doing a reserve study from one year to the next, that is when you would always want to account for inflation. If you've had a study done 3 years ago, the costs of your components are not the same as what they were shown in that study. So you're going to need to increase those and then recalibrate every so often going forward. So yeah, inflation is a critical part of what we do. And we're trying to get the powers that be to work with us on that interpretation. And I think that will change here pretty soon.
Of course. Yeah, I've received the same kind of information. It looks like that there's a big push from all fronts to be able to change that. So hopefully that does change, because obviously it's something that we do need to factor in. And even if you're a board member that's on the call right now, I mean, it's not just impacting your reserves and your reserve studies, it's impacting your day-to-day operation. I mean, we've seen insurance costs in some associations go from 20 to 100% increases. So
Right.
so it's something that we do need to start factoring in. And if there's ever a year to really factor that in, it's going to be this year. I have a question here from Maria. I think she lives in an HOA, and she says, can they speak with regards to, I guess, the playground replacement? Is that something that's normally included within a reserve study?
Yeah, absolutely. It should be. It satisfies the 4-part test we were talking about earlier. It's the association's responsibility. It has a limited useful life, right? Those things don't last forever. You can reasonably predict when, you may need to get new equipment. Typically, let's say a 15 to 20-year useful life for most commercial playground equipment. And certainly the cost is substantial. I mean, some of these playgrounds can be 6-figure replacement costs. So yeah, I would say absolutely the long-term replacement for the playground equipment, swing sets, but also perimeter fencing, shade structures, fall surfaces, anything that's contributing to that amenity. Those are all things that, yeah, they should be part of your reserve plan. The normal routine upkeep, cleaning them, making small repairs here and there, inspecting those, that should be done out of the operating budget, but you should certainly have reserves for the bigger ticket, replacement costs.
Okay, excellent. Will, is there anything else that you may want to touch up on? I do know we have some questions here from Andrew and Frederick, and I wanted to get to your questions. However, I think it's best that those questions you ask directly to your association attorney. They'll probably be the best to answer that. Is there anything else, any golden nuggets that you have? I do know, which actually I want to retract, I do want to mention to our listeners that if you haven't contacted someone to do your reserve study, I'm highly recommend you contacting Will and their firm. But make sure you do so now, because just like engineers, the cost, we'll see what ends up happening with cost, but when there's supply issues, normally costs go up. So it's better to be proactive now, whether it goes into law or not. It looks like that's where we're headed. Is there anything that your firm is doing, and what are the timelines now? Because I'm sure, as we discussed a little bit before the call, that you've received a lot more calls this year compared to last year. So what's your recommendation when it comes to board members or managers wanting to obtain a reserve study?
The sooner the better. Most associations operate on a January to December fiscal year, and so they are going to be needing to finalize their budget by October, November. You don't want to start asking about your reserve study in September. Usually it takes about 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks sometimes to do the whole process. So the earlier you begin that process, the earlier you'll have your results and still have time to ask questions and come back and work that into the budget. So the sooner the better, I would say. I know we're quite busy at this point. Our pipeline is basically booked out, I would say, at least through the end of March. If a client calls us today and say, hey, we accepted your proposal, we're typically trying to schedule that inspection at this point in April, but sometimes even longer than that, depending on where it's located. So don't wait. I mean, if this bill becomes law, there's obviously then the question of what's the timetable for compliance with the law. And so I don't know that there's a specific update on this. At one point I heard it was going to be about 18 months.
Yeah.
So if the law takes effect July 1st of this year, by December 31st of next year, 2023, unless your community has had a more recent reserve study, I think within the last 36 months, then you will need to have had one done. I know, just talking to some of our competitors recently, I know they're also in the same boat, right? Everybody, even before all this stuff happened, was already paying more attention to reserves, and that's a good thing. But yeah, there's going to be a wait list, let's say, if you wait for too long. There is one other thing I wanted to touch on, which
Sure.
we kind of talked briefly around, but it's this these milestone reports, these milestone certifications, and I wanted just to kind of give everybody the update on what's going to be required there and how often. So in the Senate bill, well, let me back up. Right now in Dade and Broward County in Florida, there's a 40-year certification requirement. So that means that once your building reaches its 40th birthday, you get a letter from the county saying you have to have an architect or an engineer inspect your property, looking for the structure, the electrical components, I guess by extension, some of the life safety issues. And then that would need to be repeated every 10 years thereafter. These bills that are on the table are proposing to expand that sort of approach statewide and to reduce the timetables. So if your property is on the coast, meaning within 3 miles of the coastline, I believe the Senate bill is going to require that initial inspection at the 20-year mark, and then every 7 years thereafter. If you're inland, I believe it's 30 and 10. I think it's when maybe 25, but I believe it's 30. That's when your first inspection is required, and then every 10 years thereafter. Those will need to be done by a licensed architect or engineer. Those will be looking at the classic, structural issues that may be facing the building. There will be a 2-part approach there, a phase 1 and then a phase 2 if it's necessary. So the phase 1 inspection is basically going to be a visual inspection, looking for trouble signs, spalling concrete, rebar staining, significant cracking, anything that may indicate there's a greater problem going on. If there are found any issues in the phase 1 inspection, then the phase 2 will be required, which will be a much more in-depth evaluation to really get in there and forensically sort of diagnose what's happening. So yeah, when you talk about the engineers and architects being very busy, they are absolutely going to be quite busy doing those inspections. Those are very lengthy processes. They can be very expensive if the building's in bad shape. So, as part of this legislation, it's not just requiring reserve studies, but it's expanding the requirements for those milestone inspections. What else? The other major idea that they're proposing in these laws is disclosure, making these documents available to owners, but also to municipalities. City building officials need to be getting copies of these engineering reports. To me, they should be available to potential buyers. There were people who bought into the Champlain Tower South building a matter of weeks before it collapsed. And, I don't know what they knew at that time. Were those people totally aware of the situation that was going on there financially, physically at the building? Or did they just think, hey, I'm moving into a nice oceanfront building? Information is power, and I think that more people getting more information is one of the major goals of this whole legislative effort, and we support that. I think that the disclosures of this information should be spread far and wide. So, yeah, I guess we'll see. The next couple of weeks are going to be interesting.
Great. Excellent. Will, thank you for providing those last golden nuggets. We've had a couple people ask, how can they contact you if they want to be able to obtain a proposal?
Sure. Our website is reservestudy.com. So if you go to reservestudy.com, right there on the homepage, we've got a little button up in the top right that says request a proposal. Go ahead and click that button. It'll lead you to a little landing page where, probably 2 minutes or so, you can input all your information, and we'll get that out to you guys as soon as we can. So yeah, that's the simplest way to do it. Reservestudy.com. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Well, Will, as always, it's always a pleasure and an honor to have you alongside me on these webinars. The information that you provide is of ton of value, and I hope our listeners, I'm pretty sure our listeners got a better understanding of what's going on, what's potentially coming their way, and what steps need to be taken to be proactive during this time. For those of you that wanted to share the video with your board members or managers within your industry, we will be posting this on the Affinity YouTube YouTube page. So feel free to link it. Also, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube page. We have weekly videos coming out. Ashley will be sharing this video with everyone. So if you want to share that with your residents, or with your board members. We want to thank you all for taking the time to really gain some additional knowledge, really dedicating yourself to the field, dedicating yourself to the residents that you serve. And we look forward and hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to the next webinar. Thank you, Will.
I was going to say, let's do it again soon. Let's
That's-
talk in,
that-
2 or 3 months. We'll have a lot more to talk about by then. And there was a lot of great questions people asked that we just didn't have time to get to. So yeah, to be continued.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Will. Looking forward
Thanks,
to it.
everybody.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.